Off the Wall Productions is proud to present Voices of the Methow. This is a series of conversations with interesting folk in and around the valley. Hey, this is Byron, and I have Cade Quigley here with me. Welcome to Voices of the Methow, Cade.
Thank you for having me.
Well, Cade, can you briefly introduce yourself for our listeners?
I was actually born in North Dakota, but most of my childhood was spent in the Black Hills of South Dakota. But after 12 years of living there in a town called Spearfish, my family decided to make a change. And so we traveled about 1,200 miles eastbound to a town on the Huron Shore in the state of Michigan. Within the next year, we decided to make another move out westward, and that took us to the Methow Valley. And so I arrived here in the summer of 2014, and I fell in love with this place right away.
So you got here just in time for the big fires, huh?
Oh yeah, I did. It was I was about 2 weeks in when the Carlton complex started. I was a little bit shocked when it happened. I was like, wow, I finally found a place that I really enjoy. And then it all started on fire. So, yeah.
Yeah, you weren't the only one who was startled, I'll tell you what. Yeah, it caught everybody by surprise. So I heard that you had a rather unique high school graduation project, a research study of the changes in the teenage brain. I've got to say, though, it seems a bit ironic, you being a teenager and all, kind of studying yourself, huh? What inspired you to choose this topic?
Well, that is true. It may seem a little bit weird for a teenager to investigate a teenager, but I do have to confess, I am quite compelled by the teenage years. It might be because I am a teenager or just because I'm interested of what developments are going on. And there's innumerable changes going on in these years that are super important for the development of this teenager from childhood into adulthood and becoming a mature adult who can be a benefit to society. And so I really wanted to understand what was going on, and there's a little bit of a history too that made me want to understand this view. One of the first things that I noticed is that I felt like there was a general misunderstanding of the teenager when I started studying this project, or what it kind of inspired me. I remember when I was first becoming a teenager, about to become a teenager, other parents and adult figures were warning my parents and myself. It's well, it's about to be survival. And I felt I was wow, I'm really excited to be a teenager now that I know I have to survive this period. And I felt that whole connotation, that whole idea of the teenage years being a rough time to live through was a little bit kind of just a negative outlook, because I feel you can make your own life instead of having to look at it in a negative way. So I've always felt that the teenage years have been looked at in a negative way. And then I'm also I was an avid ski racer for most of my life, beginning since the age of 7. And the last couple of years in my sophomore and junior year of high school, I decided to make a larger commitment and ski race for Mission Ridge Ski Academy down in Wenatchee. I would live in Wenatchee for the winter months, and then I'd move back here for the summer months and things like that. So I was kind of split in my time being in the Methow Valley and also being in Wenatchee. But what I found is that a lot of people when I was there, they were always telling me that my ideas didn't really matter, or that almost I was delusional because I was a teenager and didn't understand what the bigger world was. And I felt this was not only just a misunderstanding, but just it just did not represent the teenagers very well, because I felt I could make my own decisions and also be able to be a contributor to this team.
Cool. So can you elaborate just a little bit for me on what type of ideas you had? Do you remember any particular ideas you had that was dished or that weren't respected? Or
it was mostly just ideas when it came to saying what would be good for our psychological health or mental health. Because I did struggle a little bit with some different things going on mentally, and my coaches didn't seem to understand that and said, we're trying to just tell me that you're just not thinking right. You just need to get over it.
Get over it. That's what I was kind of thinking when you said that.
Yeah.
That might be the concept.
Right. Yeah, and so I felt that was a very negative way to approach that. And I feel especially when it comes to mental health and things like that, it was a huge part of my life, and I feel a huge part of the teenager's life. And so I wanted to really understand this. And so after this last winter, I decided I was going to hang up my skis and I wasn't going to ski race anymore. And so this last summer I was thinking, coming into my senior year, I'm like, well, I need to come up with a project, something to study, something that I'm going to be interested in instead of doing something just to get through. And then I started to realize it's like I wanted to understand what was going on, not only with myself, but with everybody in these teenage years, because you can see a lot of change. And I could see a lot of change in myself from the times I was in like 6th grade to now. And it's just kind of a wave, and I wanted to understand what was going on in that sense. So that's kind of what inspired me to pursue this project.
Well, before we talk further about your project, let me stop you there for a minute. I'm curious about what specific changes you recall from 6th grade till now.
Well, besides the whole body changing thing that everybody goes through, I noticed quite a few differences, especially in my cognitive thinking and things like that. I felt like over time, as I reached the 6th grade level and beyond, I had this ability to be able to make these connections between different subject areas, such as like math and English and things like that, where I hadn't really ever thought about before. Like all of a sudden I could like make connections between each subject instead of them being their separate entity. And then I also feel like I had the ability to think more cognitively and solve these abstract problems, such as certain types of math problems and things like that. Instead of having the solution being super easy to find, you had to go out there and try to find these solutions that I would have never been able to do before. And this is just these whole development of the brain and things like that. And then another big thing that started happening, I was starting to be really impacted by my peers and their perspectives and things like that. And while this was really important for me to broaden my ideas and feel connected to my classmates, it caused a lot of additional stress due to worrying about being accepted by this group of people because they were very significant to me. And when this was coupled with an uncertainty about my self-identity and values, I experienced a lot more mental strife and things like that during this time. But as I got older, I was able to mature a little bit more and be able to identify which of these things were completely blown out of context and what I should actually be worried about. And I was able to start to find my values and be able to think of what I wanted to do and be as a person over time.
Well, Cade, thanks for filling that out a little bit. That's pretty interesting. Getting back to your project, it sounds like you had a pretty good idea of what you wanted to cover. How did you go about finding the information?
So it first began, I was kind of looking around to see if there was any books that were related to the developments going on with the teenage brain, and I quickly found one called Brainstorm by Dr. Daniel Siegel, and it covered a lot of concepts that I was like super interested in, questions I'd always been asking myself, like what different neurological changes, otherwise known as like brain developments, going on during these teenage years that can affect behavior, and also like how to be able to like support these changes somewhat. And then also like it was directed at both parents and students, which I thought it was a very important concept. And so I began to read that and find some information from that. And then I found a mentor, Savannah Miller, who is a therapist who works at Okanagan Behavioral Health Center and Room 1. And she gave me a lot of good ideas of what to look into, what to research. And then I ended up doing my own research paper just to try to talk about all these different findings I had. And so I ended up coming up with it's like a 20 to 22 page research paper, which covers everything that I was wanting to look over, and using a bunch of resources and trying to understand what's going on with the teenage brain, but also how like the environment can impact the teenage brain and everything like that. And so it was quite the process, but I found a lot of information and was super excited about it.
After finishing this research paper, did you feel confident you understood the neurological developments of the teenage brain?
Well, being a teenager in high school, it's hard to cover a lot of information that people usually cover throughout their years of college, like up to 8 years of college, like trying to understand these things. And so I was a little bit unsure if I knew exactly what I was talking about. So as a way to try to validate some of the things I had found, to make sure I knew what I was, a little bit what I was talking about at least. I took a trip over to Okanagan and went to Okanagan Behavioral Health Care. I talked to some psychiatrists and behavioral health professionals, including counselors involved in school districts such as Tonasket, Okanagan, Omak, to try to get their opinion too about the whole misconceptions behind the teenager in general. And so it was very good to talk to people and get their opinions as well. And I found out that most of my information I found was very valid indeed. So I had done good research, and then they're also able to give me a little bit more information that I hadn't thought of before. Originally, I wanted to somehow validate these different neurological changes in the teenage brain by doing some type of experiment within our school district, or doing something that would have some quantitative information, some numbers, or something to be able to show to the community to prove or to debunk any of these things going on. And
kind of measurable effects or...
exactly. And so I started to realize, though, that to do a full-blown experiment would be incredibly arduous. It'd take a ton of work. They suggested that I do something more of a survey. And so I started to think about how I could do a survey to share with teenagers within our community. And so I began to do that. That was the next step kind of in the process, trying to think about what I wanted to do with the survey, but also what other information I wanted to find.
So it sounds like you had some pretty good support going into this. You had some mentoring, and that's great. It sounds like you learned a ton of information about these developments. Could you try and explain to me and our listeners about what's going on in the teenage brain?
Sure. It's very interesting because there's actually a lot of developments going on. And if we back up 20 years into the past, people didn't actually realize that there was any neurological developments going on in the teenage brain. People thought that the brain had finished developing by the time you were about 10 to 12 years old. And by the time you reached puberty, people thought your brain is basically stopped. And so people started to realize with neuroimaging techniques such as the CAT scan, the PET scan, the MRI, the fMRI, things like that, that there's actually a lot of things going on. And actually the number keeps raising to as when the brain stops developing, because adolescence is an important concept to understand. And so adolescence is a period of time between 11 to 26 years old, basically going on starting from the beginning of puberty until your brain stops developing, you become an adult. And so that end number has been raising. It used to be 11 to 22, now it's 11 to 26, and I've heard recent numbers 11 to 28, 11 to 30, so people are starting to realize that the brain is continually developing instead of what people thought in the past, where it would just reach its maximum and then you would slowly start to learn new things, but it wouldn't be the huge developments that you see in childhood. But there's incredible things going on in the teenage brain. And so a few of them to cover just quickly. One is called myelination. And so to understand this, you have to think about the little cells within our brain called the neurons. If you think about a tree, and it has this base, and then it has all these branches spreading out to different areas of the brain. And so on these branches, there's these things called axons. It's basically just the branches themselves connecting neuron to neuron, sending these messages to one another to either tell you to move or tell you to breathe, things like that. And myelination is basically this type of cell, this white matter that starts to wrap around this axon. And it doesn't sound like it actually do much, but it increases neural firings. It increases
conductivity, so to speak.
It basically makes it function a lot faster and more efficiently. And I was told when I went to a lecture that your overall brain capacity once you go through this myelination is about 3 times as fast in each individual area of neurons. And so overall, your overall brain's connections, if you think about all the numbers, is something 300,000 times faster or something along those lines. So it gets way more efficient, and these connections become, again, more efficient. You're able to make connections, and this is why teenagers can think more abstractly, think a lot faster, and things like that.
I've noticed that, actually. Yeah, since in my aging, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So another thing going on in the teenage brain is called synaptogenesis, which is a very large word, but what it's basically saying, so at the end of each of these dendrites, each of these axons and these branches are these things called synapses, which send these chemical messengers to each neuron.
Okay, yeah.
And so synapses start to expand in the teenage brain, and you start to see a lot more synapses being created across different areas, across different lobes, across the two hemispheres, across the corpus callosum, which is between the two hemispheres, connecting the right and the left, so you can make these connections. But then, interesting enough, your brain goes through this automatic cell death called pruning. And so all of a sudden you have all of these neurons that start to die. And what you start to realize, though, is that the neurons that are dying are the ones that haven't been practiced very much, the ones that aren't very strong inside our brain. And so the way I would explain this to students is that if you think about something you practice like every day, for example, for me, I've practiced the quadratic equation over and over again since 8th grade. And so like before long, it's like negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. And so if you practice something over and over again, you'll remember it. But then if you don't like practice something, or if you don't think about something, then all of a sudden it gets cut out. Teenagers have a greater ability of being able to focus on one thing at a time, or go into depth with one thing, while when you're a child you can be super good at a ton of things, be able to be well-rounded in that sense, but you're never like super good, have a great understanding of one thing. And that's why like you probably don't remember brushing your teeth 3 days ago, because that was a memory at one point in your brain. But then with this pruning process, it gets cut out. For like me, I've forgotten a lot of like the grammar structures, a lot of the grammar rules. And so since I didn't really practice that much, it didn't matter that much to my brain chemistry and things like that, those neurons get cut out. And so you forget things like that. But then things you really enjoy, things you really focus on, those are the things I remembered. So that's kind of the whole process of synaptogenesis and pruning. Another thing that's going on is this idea of the neurotransmitters. So I talked about them a little bit earlier. So if we think back to our tree, the different branches going out. So the neurotransmitters are basically the things going from one branch to another. You could think about it as leaves, but they get transferred to another neuron and then they get transferred back. And so neurotransmitters are the things that tell us like how we're feeling, basically. Like some big ones that people have probably heard of are like serotonin, endorphins, and also another one's called dopamine. And so dopamine is very important in the teenage brain, and it becomes super relevant to teenage behaviors and things like that. Research has actually recently showed that dopamine has a bigger impact on the body, on the teenagers' behaviors than hormones do. Huh. And that's one of the big misconceptions out there, that hormones are what drives the teenager to do a lot of their behaviors. But dopamine, this neurotransmitter that becomes super expansive throughout the brain, especially in the frontal lobe, which is basically right in front of the forehead, if you're thinking about in terms of where it is in your brain. Dopamine is known as being the reward center of the brain.
Right, I was thinking that. Yeah.
And so since teenagers have this higher level of dopamine, it means that they have a higher likelihood of wanting to try new things and trying things that maybe more risk-taking, things like that, more impulsive in nature. And so that's why you see the stereotype of the teenager following something along the lines of trying to take more risks, doing things that wouldn't seem like very smart. And people think this is because teenagers don't think they can get injured. But what research has shown is that teenagers are perfectly capable of understanding that whatever they're doing might be injuring them or might be doing bad things to them, such as drugs and alcohol. But their reward center, this idea that if they do this, it could be great, it could be amazing, because that overtakes everything else going on. And so that's why you see teenagers trying new things, such as maybe doing things that are more risk-taking, such as like cliff jumping or, rock climbing, things like that. And also wanting to try new things such as, sex and drugs and alcohol, things like that, because it's something new. And they just think of that reward of what it could do for them.
Well, isn't there something too? I think back on my own teenage, was a long time ago, but I think that autonomy was really highly important to me.
Right.
As far as don't tell me what to do, let me find out for myself.
Right, yeah. And that's another big thing. We start to see teenagers, they start to become more autonomous from their parents. They start to break away somewhat from their parents, but it's a natural cycle of trying to become more independent, which you see in many species out there. As they start to enter that adult period, they're supposed to be able to break away from the nest, from their home. And so that's why you start to see teenagers being a lot more affected by peers and things like that. And that's another thing that we see in social psychology with the teenager, at least, that if their peers are around them, they're much more likely to do things that are risk-taking, because you have a higher number of kids who are all thinking about what could be great, what could be this reward center. And so you see kids like trying to impress other people, things like that.
Well, I'm not sure that that's just teenagers.
Right, yeah.
You know, I think that it kind of goes along the lines of, outside teenagers too, yeah. Well, that's really interesting, Cade. Can you tell me a little bit more about your research?
So another development going on in the teenage brain that I've been studying as well is developments going on in the frontal lobe, especially called the prefrontal cortex. I mentioned this a little bit ago, and it's super important to be able to do what we call executive functioning, which is basically being able to like create your own schedule, be able to think individually, be able to make connections, being able to function just as a human. It basically makes us human, because all of the other brain circuitry is just things, like emotion, motivation, things like that. But the prefrontal cortex is what makes us human, the wise man and the Homo sapien.
Is there language? Language isn't that the center for language and things like that? You lose that, you kind of lose yourself, huh?
Right, yeah. And so, the prefrontal cortex is super important for being able to be a engaging person in society and being able to be good for both yourself and people around you. And so you start to see this development of the prefrontal cortex during the later part of the adolescent period. You don't see this until you're 18 to 26. So you start to see the development of the prefrontal cortex. And as this starts to happen, you start to be able to do this executive functioning, but also things like the dopamine. It starts to get inhibited. So it starts to get stopped because your prefrontal cortex starts to intervene and say, okay, this may not be a good idea, or things like that. So you start to not be influenced as much by this, this reward drive that we just talked about a little bit. Mm-hmm. And so, this prefrontal cortex, as it develops, it allows the teenager to basically become an adult and become more efficient with things going on. It's also understood now, according to research, that before the prefrontal cortex gets developed, that memory encoding that's going on in the adolescence appears to be more robust during negative experiences. Mm-hmm. And so that's why you may see that teenagers tend to focus on the negative, even though they could be told a lot of positive things. An example I would use is a teacher may tell a student wow, you had a great research paper and everything was really good about it, but it looked like you had a couple of grammatical errors. You may want to check that. In the mind of the teenager, they mostly focused on those negative things, those negative aspects, that you had a few grammatical errors. And so they start to rationalize, wow, that I did really bad on that. And that's also why you see teenagers more worried about their appearance around others too, because they're always thinking about the negative, what other people may be thinking about them in a negative way, and things like that. And so,
man, I can relate to that.
Right.
Even now,
right,
sometimes,
Right, but it's definitely more prevalent in the teenage years, and then once that prefrontal cortex starts to develop, then you don't see this as robust of memory encoding going on during negative experiences, and you start to see more balanced with both positive and negative instead of just negative.
Having some perspective.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the last development I kind of looked into a little bit was the difference between the sexes, so the difference between the male and female brain. Mm-hmm. And interesting enough, as you enter puberty, this is one of the few things that is influenced by hormones, but your brain actually has different sizes. I'd make this joke to students. I would say that males have larger brains, and all the, boys would be super excited, giving each other high fives. And then I'd tell them very shortly after that it doesn't actually mean anything. If anything, there's more empty volume in the boy's brain than the girl's brain. There's this, so the limbic area in the brain is responsible for emotion and motivation. And so in this limbic area is this structure called the amygdala. And the amygdala is responsible for fear and being able to handle that, basically, being able to handle fear and anger. And males have a larger amygdala than females do, and females have a larger hippocampus. And so this larger amygdala in the male that occurs during the teenage years means that boys are much more likely to be aggressive in nature, be more, that's why you see like boys maybe like wrestling more or things like that, maybe taking some more risks. And also boys are more, when it comes to mental health, they're more likely to get some psychiatric disorders instead of other types of disorders. So things like ADHD, Tourette's syndrome, obsessive compulsive disorders, these are more involved or more likely to develop in teenage. In the boys, it's more expulsive, you could say. It's more outward when it comes to mental health disorders. While females, since they have this smaller amygdala, they're more likely to have affective and anxiety disorders, which is things such as anxiety, as you can imagine, and also depression, things like that. And so it's more intrusive. That's the way I understood it, at least. And so it's interesting how, just the different size of different brain structures can affect how someone reacts to things or are more likely to develop something else.
What about that hippocampus? I mean, for the female, if it's larger, what's the function?
Right. So the hippocampus is involved in memory development. And so it's understood that the larger hippocampus is more involved with emotional processing. And so it is seen that females are much more likely to be able to identify someone's like body language than a boy teenager is. And so girls are able to see, if someone is feeling sad or anxious or something else just by looking at body language, when boys may be a little bit more oblivious to it.
Is that kind of like empathetic then?
You could say it is along that line, but it's more of being able to identify it. But in that way, since you are able to identify it, you may be more empathetic towards it too.
Oh, okay. So you're making the distinction then being able to observe it and what you do with it, in other words? Okay.
And so males, since they have this larger amygdala, they're more likely to develop addictive behaviors such as substance abuse. And then again, since they have this lack of maturity of the prefrontal cortex, they're more likely to take risk-taking and things like that. But so are girls as well in that sense. But it was interesting to see these differences between the sexes and see how you can start to identify them if you actually look for them a little bit. In my life, at least, I've been able to see it a little bit.
Yeah. Well, that's a lot of information. But did you have everything you needed yet?
So I had all this information. I was like, wow, this is super intriguing. This is super enlightening. But I realized I wanted to understand what I could personally do and what all teenagers could do, at least in the Methow Valley, to be able to benefit these changes. Because just like anything, there must be something that allows you to be able to understand it a little better and also be able to make it easier for your body to make these changes to support a healthier mind and things along those lines.
It's kind of like empowering. Knowledge is power, so to speak. Okay.
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And so my mentor, Savannah, she told me that the same guy who wrote the book I was reading at the beginning of the year called Brainstorm.
And who was that by?
Dr. Daniel Siegel.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And so he was giving a lecture in Seattle about these different connections in your brain and on interpersonal neurobiology, which is kind of a big term, but it's basically talking about introspection and also the connection between the environment and the body. And so I went to this lecture in Seattle and I got a lot of super interesting information that I would like have never thought of before. And definitely some of it went over my head because I was surrounded by a lot of behavioral health professionals who had like 8 years of practice in like a college setting, and I was a senior in high school. It had, you know, half a year doing individual studying of these things. So, but I got a general understanding, and one of the most interesting things that he talked about, at least that I also taught to a lot of people, is this idea of the mind. And so people talk about the mind a lot in society, but you start to realize there's no actual definition of what the mind is. People always think it's just like this thing that's in our brain that's going, you know, just like thinking about things and things like that. But he started to make us think that it's a lot bigger than that. There's a lot more things going on. Then he began to make us realize that the mind is not just inside your body, it's all around us. So the mind is not just what's going on in your head, but also the environment around you and how that's connected to your mind. And also he introduced this idea of the collective mind, basically that there's these things, these inborn things that everybody has that's part of our mind.
Let me break in here just for a second and see if I understand this. So are you talking about that there's a distinction between perhaps the physiology of the actual brain, the body, or the physical processes that are going on, all these chemicals and all this other stuff, then there's another part that's undefinable, that's...
Right, and he was really clear too that we still don't really know what the mind is, because like even though through all of our research and all these things that we've been finding about, you know, the brain and brain chemistry, there's a lot of things that can't be explained and things that are still trying to be understood. And so he was trying to make us think that it's not just these changes going on in our brain, but it's the connection between our environment around us too, because the environment can really change how we develop as well. He introduced this idea of what's called integration of the brain. Integrating the brain allows you to basically do these things I was talking about earlier, being able to support this myelination, this synaptogenesis, be able to have executive functioning. And so integration is basically making connections. And so another interesting aspect of integration is that not only when you take in something new do you make connections, but you think about how it's connected to other things, but also how it's individual in itself. So you're making these connections, but also individualizing things. And so there's different ways that you can help integration. And so these were super important for like the teenage years. And he even talked about this a little bit, like how it will help you basically become a healthier human being if you try to allow this integration. And if you don't have integration, you either lead to what he called chaos or rigidity, where chaos is you don't really know what's going on. You're not really in control of your life. You're kind of a little bit disorganized, yeah. And then this rigidity is just you're so like basically uptight or just like unable to think about these connections, how you could connect new things.
Kind of boxed in
basically,
thinking.
Yeah. And so integration is, he described it as a river, and so you just have to like, it makes these connections, it makes things flow a lot better. And so different things he talked about that can help with integration. One of them is called Mindfulness Practices.
Mm-hmm.
And so he introduced this thing called the Wheel of Awareness, but basically when it comes to mindfulness practices, you can do anything that's along the lines of like meditation and what we call introspection. So introspection is allowing yourself to be aware of what's going on in your body. Do I dare say the word mind, but what's going on in your brain, what's going on with your thinking and things like that, being able to have this, again, introspection, being aware, because a lot of the times it's human nature to just try to be focused on the future, always thinking about what's going to be happening. Doing these mindfulness practices allows you to actually get into the moment and allows your brain to basically like catch up, but also make these connections, be aware of what's going on around you.
You know, that's interesting you say that, because I did a interview with Sharon Cohen, who is a mindfulness practitioner in the Valley. Mm-hmm. She teaches mindfulness. I took a class with her a couple of years ago. From my experience, what I'm hearing you say, which is kind of resonating with me, I find that I have a better perspective perhaps a broader perspective by just quieting my mind, you know, in some ways. What I'm hearing you say is, number one, there's environment is a big factor in how you develop, or but and then also perhaps there are techniques like mindfulness that you can use to enhance your life, and also your perspective of how your coping skills and ability to process the things that happen to you. Or does that ring a bell?
Right. Yeah, that's basically what all these things of integration are, like things that can like help you just be able to be a little bit healthier, be able to be more aware of what's going on, make these connections. And so again, mindfulness was one of them. Another one that was talked about a lot is relationships. So relationships, not just saying, your loved one, but people in your life. So friends, peers, family, teachers, things like that, for the high school student at least. He brought up an interesting point that researchers now understand that relationships are the number one indicator for health. So if you give a researcher or someone all the things included in your relationship, like how good your relationship is, how you're connected with your family, things like that, that can predict your health better than anything else. And so having good relationships in your life, having meaningful relationships, allows you to live a lot healthier and also be able to be a lot more integrated in your mind. And so at least for the teenager, at least, but also for everybody, having connections with people in your life is super important to be able to be healthy. Other things that Hugh talked about is sleep. So being able to have enough sleep. This is not too much of a surprise. This is just being able to be healthy in general. You need plenty of sleep. Another thing that he talked about is nutrition. Being able to do like my plate, being able to have a healthy balance of everything, being able to have a healthy diet. Another thing he talked about is novelty, being able to have new experiences. And so this is super prevalent to the teenager too, since this whole idea of dopamine, this reward center. It's actually good that teenagers are able to try out new things, which is why some people are kind of challenging this whole idea of having the classical classroom setting, because if you're just going through the same processes every day, it's not allowing the teenager to use this creative power that's really going on. And so that's another interesting thing you're talking about. Another interesting thing that helps integration is humor. Being able to have humor in your life, which makes sense because we're all a lot happier when we have a little bit of humor, at least. Another thing that helps is exercise. So aerobic exercise, especially, so things that will get your heart racing, get you breathing a lot. Doing that allows you to integrate your brain as well. And then the last one that I thought was really interesting is being able to pay close attention. And so people oftentimes don't think about paying attention very much. People oftentimes think that their memory is only so good that they can remember things because their memory is not very good compared to other people. But what people don't realize is that memory is pretty consistent across most people. The thing that's different between someone who's able to remember things and not remember things is how much attention that person was giving when they were encoding that information.
That makes sense.
So if you're able to pay more attention to things while you're learning them, then you're more likely to remember it.
Interesting, yeah.
And so if you pay attention, you're more likely to learn it than if you don't, which makes sense if you think about it.
So let me get this straight then. So you got mindfulness, sleep, nutrition, and what else?
Humor.
Was I paying attention?
Yeah. Humor, novelty, paying attention, and then relationships.
Yeah.
Being able to have good relationships.
Right.
And so these things all allow you to be more integrated in the mind. And so, I found this information and I was super excited.
Right. Okay, so you have all this information gathered. How did you go about sharing it?
So I decided that at first I was just going to do a community presentation where I could share all these findings to people in the community, but then I realized that teenagers might as well know as well. I decided to present to all of the students in our school, and so I did I did like 12 to 15 presentations in our school to all the different students. And I also, like I said earlier, I decided to give out a survey where I try to find out different opinions about the teenager.
I'm curious, was this school-wide? Was it your class? Your survey, was it seniors? Was it
It was every
general
student
population?
in the school.
Cool. Yeah. General. Yeah, that would only make sense, but I'm just curious.
And so some of the questions on there were, do you feel there are any stereotypes or ideas labeled to the teenager that are inaccurate? And then I also did a mindfulness practice with all the students just to see if it made them feel better or at least feel a little bit more calm or be able to feel like they're able to think a little more straight. And of all the students I did, it was like 62% felt much better. And then there was only probably like, I think it was like 8% who felt worse, and then everybody else either felt the same or felt better after doing this mindfulness practice. And I did that with about, I think, 230 of the students in the school, like 250 or so.
Nice.
So I did it with most of the students, and it was super good to hear that. And then I also asked the question of how could you improve your relationship with your peers, parents, adult figures, and teachers. And so it was interesting because I got a lot of answers that, you know, that people wouldn't think were typical of the teen. Like teenagers are very aware that they could do things to improve their relationships and also things, you know, with their parents, with their peers, because it is a stressful time in life, but the teenager is very capable of being able to think for themselves and make these own ideas and be able to be, again, creative and do things like that. So the third question was one thing that I wanted to cover a lot more of, and that question was, what changes would you hope to see in a society to enrich the teenage experience? Because again, with this whole project, I didn't want it just to like inform the public. I wanted people to like try to improve the teenage experience, because I feel like if teenagers have a healthier life, it'll make it overall generally a better society in general, because the teenager has a lot of potential to make change and be able to do things like that. And so I have a few quotes from this anonymous survey of what students said they would like to see improved. So one quote that a student said was, they would like to see more stories about successful experiences with teenagers in the news instead of things that go wrong. Mm-hmm. And so they just, you know, that again, that whole idea that they're always talking about negative things with the teenager. And then another person said, for people to remember their own teenage years before they judge teens.
Oh, there you go.
And so there's something we all have to think about a little bit too. And then another student said, no bullying and not judging people when you don't even know them or by how they look. Giving teens a break, because we all make mistakes, and we teens especially do. And so, again, being able to identify that teens actually realize, like, none of us are perfect. Like, we realize that, but it would be good if, like, you know, society would realize like our potential and things like that. And then another student says, I want society to realize the amount of stress and pressure that is being put on teens, because there's a lot of things that are going on in today's world that are a lot more stress than you would think are being put on the teens, like especially with schoolwork and things like that. They're starting to increase. And then the whole idea of social media, that people, like especially teenagers, are super worried about their self-image and things like that. And so teenagers are experiencing a lot of stress. And so they want to, you know, be able to have people see that. So yeah, those were just a few of the quotes from the students, of the 201 students that I was able to do this survey with. And so once I had this information, I decided to also do a community presentation in the school, which ended up being a lot smaller. It was a lot smaller of a group of people, but it was good to be able to teach them what I had learned this year, but also talk about the potential of being able to enrich the teenage experience, so what they could do to enrich the teenage experience. But then I also asked them, like, what could the teenager do to enrich their experience? Because it's a two-way thing, you know, just like anything in life, just like every highway in the nation, just like Newton's third law, you know, everything is a two-way deal. It can't just be a one-way thing where parents are only supporting the teenager. The teenager also has to support the parents, the adult figures in their lives, because connections are more important than anything else out there.
And so what does that look like, the teenager supporting the parents?
I think, again, like I talked about, like the importance of having relationships. So like instead of like completely breaking away from the parent, like you sometimes hear about being able to rationalize and be able to consider their opinions, because again, teenagers will later realize after their adolescent period how much like their parents did affect them, how much their opinion did like change their ideas and things like that. And so having that connection, and then just having an overall idea of acceptance to all people in society, I guess, is something that's super important for teenagers to have.
And isn't it easier, I guess, environment, doesn't that play a crucial role in how a person develops? I mean, like if you're in an intolerant situation in like say a home setting where there's maybe not a lot of tolerance, for example, doesn't that limit possibilities? I mean, like thinking and feeling, perhaps, and perhaps with relationships, being, if you're not shown or given that example of how to be. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so things like the home environment and things like that is super important for like the development and things like that, and also again to have those connections and to have a healthier mind and a healthier life. And I talked to parents about that too. I talked like briefly about the different types of parenting, things like that, and like what supports the teenager the best and what they can do to have a better, connection with their children, things like that. Or just, teenagers they know.
Right. So Cade, what is it you want people, whether they be adults, students, or people in the community, to get out of this project? What would you like the takeaway to be?
So again, as I talked about, I wanted everybody to understand and support this idea of an enriched teenage experience to improve the overall view of the teenager in society, but to also improve the teenager's life as well as parents. And so if you look at some of the statistics using like the Healthy Youth Survey, which was conducted a couple of years ago, you realize there are like quite a few problems that need to be answered in our community, such as the amount of students who have depressive feelings in our school is 33%, which is 13% higher than the national average. And then our school, or at least Okanagan County, has the highest suicidal ideation rate in the state. And also you see that, I believe it's like 27% of students enjoy being in school. So that leaves 73% of students who don't enjoy being at school.
Is that this particular area, or?
That's our school.
School.
Yeah, that's our school. The only one that wasn't is suicidal ideation. That one's for all of Okanagan County.
Right.
But
Liberty Bell
Junior Senior High School, so 7th through 12th grade. And then you also see that, there's a lot of drug and alcohol abuse instead of just trying it, but yeah, you see a lot of students who are using it regularly. I think it's like 35% of the student population who abuses drugs and alcohol. And so you see these things that are going on, and so I wanted to enrich the teenage experience. So I came up with a list using what I found from my surveys of what this would be. And so it begins with an improved viewpoint of the teen in modern society, a healthier lifestyle for youth and parents, a decrease in depression and suicidal ideation in our school district and the valley in general, less stress from disputes with adult figures, improved relationships with peers, adults, and people in the community, a decrease in drug and alcohol abuse, more students who enjoy being at school, no more bullying inside and outside of school, because our students, I think it's 1 in 5 students are bullied in our school according to the Healthy Youth Survey.
Really?
Yeah, 20%.
Oh, that's,
So that's pretty unfortunate as well. And then I'd like to see more teenagers trying to integrate the mind, having that connection. And then an overall view that teenagehood is a time to prosper instead of a time to survive through, which I felt like when I entered my teenage years. So just an overall better feeling, overall better attitude towards the teenage years.
I gotta say, what I was just contemplating while you were speaking is that, you hear about teenage stress and all this thing, or I hear about it, we're talking about it right now, and I'm thinking about how much more your generation has to deal with than like mine. I grew up in the 60s. I was I was at the tail end of the 60s when I graduated in 1971. And we had stress there. We had the Vietnam War and things like that, but it wasn't, we didn't have the social media, that's a whole thing, and all these different things. There's just it seems like it's a much more complicated and stressful, potentially stressful than when I was growing up, to navigate now through what's going on.
Definitely, and I agree with that too. It's it's hard to compare generations because again, there's always different factors going on.
Right.
But just the overall expectations of teenagers nowadays too, with at least most teenagers feel like they have to get a secondary education after high school, and also being able to have very good grades, but also having this social connection with everybody and also being liked by everybody through social media and things like that. And teenagers get really stressed about things like that, and it's not very healthy for development, at least.
Right. Well, before we move on, I've got one question for you. Was there any contributing factor to the higher depression rates in this county, for example? Did you research pinpoint any reasons why it's higher in this particular county in the state?
I wasn't really able to. I didn't do any research in that field, but I kind of hypothesized that at least some of it must be coming from relationships and things like that. And so that's why I focused that into my whole project, being able to integrate the brain better by having better relationships with people, and also the importance of the environment around you. And so again, with the overall better mood towards the teenager is probably less likely to have all those stressful disputes or things like that.
And so if you were a stressed out teenager with few resources or friends, how would you go about enriching your life?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I guess you always have to look for help. I feel like because if you try to approach something alone, it's never going to work. And so there's a lot of people who are out there who are there to help you. And we're starting to also see teenagers taking the initiative in that sense too, because in our school, a group was created by one of my fellow graduates named Isabel Salas, and she created the HOPES group, which is helping our peers end suicide, because the school hadn't created any group to make suicide awareness in our school, even though we had an incredibly high suicide ideation rate. And so she created this group and trained a lot of students, including myself, on what to be able to do to identify someone who looks like they're having a difficult time with the day-to-day life of a teenager, and being able to offer them help and being able to make sure that people know that they're cared for and things along those lines.
Oh, well said. So it sounds like reaching out is pretty important if you're if you're trying to build relationships or maybe increase the quality of your life.
Yeah, you definitely need to reach out because it's a lot more difficult when you're just trying to fight things like that alone.
Yeah, I could speak to that personally. It helps to find mentors and people who can help you gain perspective. Yeah. Well, man, those are all great topics. Sounds like listening and respect factor here a lot.
Yeah, it's been good to talk to people in the community and being able to share these ideas. And I've heard a lot of people enjoy listening and learning about this. And I'm glad I'm able to do this too, because this is just another way to, spread the word to people about what I studied and be able to hopefully learn a little bit about it. And I think it's really useful information that everybody can use, not just teenagers, to have a healthier life.
Right. Well, Cade, what about teenagers starting to take initiative in our society?
Right. So even though I studied this and was hoping that teenagers would make a bigger impact, just this year alone, we've started to see that teenagers are starting to make a bigger impact in society, or starting to be recognized by society that we are capable of making great change with things going on. And one of the big things that happened this year, at least for teenagers, was the March for Our Lives movement, which was initiated and conducted and completely controlled by teenagers. And for those of you who don't know the March for Our Lives movement, it's a movement for gun control to make sure that there's no more school shootings And the people who were in the lead of it were involved at their school. There was a school shooting at Parkland High School where 17 died, and it sparked this nationwide protesting where kids basically were chanting "not one more," because just this year alone there's been more people who've died in schools than there have been military who have died. Which is interesting to think about. It's
in the military, what do you mean by?
In the overall military, there's been
this year.
There's
been
less deaths in the military than there have been in school shootings.
Got it. Wow. Okay.
So, and that's, people who are actively in war and people who are in a public school setting. So it makes you think a little bit about that. And so we started to see this at our school as well. And so on March 14th, following the, this was a month after the school shooting that was on February 14th. So on March 14th, students at Libertyville planned a 17-minute walkout to honor the 17 students who died at the Parkland, not just students, but students and adults who had died at Parkland.
Mm-hmm.
And so 17 students, including myself, talked about each of these different people and gave a little bit of background. And we wanted to make sure we were politically neutral in that, on that day, to make sure we were just respecting these people who had lived their life and were taken away at a young age or too early. And so we're just trying to support these people who had gone through this and the people of Parkland High School. And this happened nationwide. And so, but then it continued. And so on March 14th, there was the actual March for Our Lives movement. So it was the one that there happened at Washington, D.C., and there was another one in Twisp. And so I attended that one, and students, there were several student speakers, including a couple of my fellow graduates. And also one of my teachers was able to talk, and other teachers are talking about the whole idea that we need to try to make a change in our society so we don't just see students dying every day. Because everybody can agree that people shouldn't be dying in school. That's just a moral dilemma, right? Like, I don't think anybody would argue that there should be students dying in school.
Right.
And so people kind of need to decide, like, at what point are we going to sacrifice, all freedom to, guns and arms, basically, to make sure that students are safe.
Right. That's a pretty polarized subject.
Right. Yeah. It brings up a lot of debate, and that's why I usually tend to try to avoid it as much. I mean, I'm politically active about it. I believe there needs to be something done so we can feel safe in school, because students don't feel safe in school anymore. It's sad when you have to start training, kids in elementary school in like 3rd and 4th grade to practice what to do if there was a school shooter.
Right.
Which, they shouldn't have to go through that. They shouldn't have to be worried about that.
No, I completely agree. Well, I know that the subject of gun control is really polarized, but let me ask you this. How about, you were saying, I believe, that the students led this nationally and student driven. Well, I was in that walk in Twisp, and I noticed that the students were out in front, and to me that felt really good. That right. That you were basically leading the way.
Right, because in the past it's been, the adults trying to make decisions for the teenagers as to, what, the legislature would say for, gun control, things like that. And so now teenagers are starting to represent themselves instead of trying to let the adults represent them, because, we have the capability to do that. And I think that supported like what I've been talking about in my project, that the teenager has a ton of capability to make change. They just need to start doing it, and we're starting to see it, and society needs to accept that we are here too.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Well put. Yeah, I think that teenagers need to be recognized as being capable and being able to have some good ideas and be able to act on them. I don't know if it's a disconnect. I don't want to put too much of a label on it, but I was finding, for example, that I wanted to appreciate the teens that led the group. You arrived at the assembly where we heard some people talking, when we assembled after the march, and I wanted to express my genuine appreciation and to say something, but I felt awkward. Like I didn't know exactly how to articulate what the appreciation that I was feeling. And I wonder about that on a generational or level, about being able to communicate between age groups and things like that.
Right, and I think, I have talked about this before, I think that generational gaps or just stereotypes in general are just they break down societies, and I think people need to start to break away from those ideas about these generational gaps and just realize that we're all people. We all have very similar ideas, morals. I mean, we're all individuals, obviously, but we can all agree on most things. So just being able to go out there and communicate that in the first place instead of feeling awkward about it is super important for developing towards what's the next step of being a healthy community.
Oh, well said. Well said. So, Cade, we've covered a lot of ground here. Nice job in gathering all this information.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been quite the process, to say the least. But it's been very enlightening for me. I'm definitely a changed person now.
Oh, I believe that. It sounds like making a difference and helping to empower yourself and others is a real driving force for you.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's always a goal for most of us, at least, to try to make a change and feel like we've made a beneficial change. And so I feel like this is maybe just the beginning. There could be future research for me, a future career path for me in understanding these things. And so I hope I can make a change in our community.
That's great. Yeah. Well, is there anything we missed or that you'd like to say before we wrap up for now?
I don't think so. I think I've covered just about everything that I want to.
Well, nice job. So this is Byron and
Cade
saying,
so long for now, and keep it on the route.
Nice. Yeah. Cool. You've been listening to Voices of the Methow, an off-the-wall production. Until next time, thanks for listening.